who are now in Great Britain as a part of the Allied offense to beat Hitler on his own ground. For the time being, you'll be Britain's guest. The purpose
American soldiers, they were very friendly, very smart.
There was a different method behind the Americans, and it's something that's always stuck in my memory.
On meeting them, getting to know them, our door was never closed.
I thought that they were not American film stars, but fighting men.
Margam Park was one of many centres of American activity. By late 1944, nearly 60,000 men of 4 infantry divisions had arrived in Wales, together with many non-combat service troops. Such a large force could not fail to make a big impact on the war-weary Welsh people. After 4 long years of separation from loved ones, air raids, food rationing and many other hardships, the Yanks brought with them new hope for the future. And for many in Wales, it was the brightest period of an otherwise bleak war.
And I can remember well saying to my aunt, well, Auntie Doris, we've heard the Americans are coming to Tenby, and there's only one thing we've got to do, is bolt the doors and the windows.
We got on the train, we drove all night. At 1 o'clock in the morning, some ladies got on board the train. We stopped at the station and gave us sausage rolls and other things. And then we finally, in the morning, we landed at Port Talbot.
Well, we used to go to Wales, to Brecon, at the artillery range. And at the time for artillery work, and each time we stayed about 10 days. And we'd fly the Cub down to set up our tents so we could spend the night. We always slept by the airplane at night. The mechanics got out and found out all about where to go with the civilians down there. And they found a very nice family who invited all of the mechanics and the pilots to come down for a little party. And a little party we did have. And not only that, they invited us to come again. And 3 days later, we were at another little party at this particular house. And everybody was more than friendly. And in fact, one of the mechanics started going out with the Welsh girl.
When we arrived in Margam, the weather was very nice. And it was very nice in November, and it was nice in December. But God forgive January. We had rain, and we had rain, and we never saw so much rain in our lives as we had that time.
I had been in hospital at the time they arrived in Port Talbot, and I was quite surprised when I came out. I'd had a foot operation, and I was on oath to my mother never to have anything to do with Americans.
On meeting them, getting to know them, our door was never closed.
I, being adventurous and young, couldn't wait to get my foot healed so that I could go dancing and meet some of these wonderful Americans. You see, these wild Americans.
Leaving the house early one morning, I was halfway up the hill, not a soul in the world, only me. And coming toward me was a uniform, man in uniform, and I didn't know this uniform. And my first thoughts, oh, we've been invaded. And we stared at each other, and a smile, and good morning, ma'am. Swell morning. What a relief, and that was my first encounter with an American.
Well, the first impressions that we had was the awful way in which they drove up and down the main road.
It was so different to our own soldiers. I suppose being a boy, I was interested in watching the way that they drilled and that sort of thing. And the British Army drilled in a more upright way, you can say, in that the arms are swung right up to arm level and that sort of thing. And the Americans seem to march in a different way.
We had been so used to dancing, it sounds all so frivolous, to dancing with the British troops with their rough khaki, and even my own brothers had these uniforms, so I knew what they were all about. But these were smooth, very smart, brown shoes generally, very well polished. Yes, I was very impressed with the uniforms.
Eye-catching, very smart, and the two-tone. It was really, I thought it was really striking.
They were very forward. The first ones I met were in a local church dance, and the very first one who asked me to dance, I couldn't believe it. He was so familiar, and I was only 18 and very shy, and I was sitting down or standing, and before I knew, I was held in a very close embrace and staggered at the difference in the approach of the Americans, how extrovert they were compared with British men.
For a while, when they came up and asked me to dance, I used to say to them, I'm sorry, I can't dance, and then I got fed up with that. So I got up and danced, and it was all just about getting throwing over your shoulders, through your legs. It was absolutely fantastic.
We had dances from Monday to Saturday. There were dances at the Y, dances at the Masonic Club, there were dances at St. Joseph down in Aberravon, and there was also dances in some place. I went there once. The hall was very small, and I was not that good a dancer, and I needed room, and I couldn't do any dancing in that room, so I only went there once and never went back.
They were quite romantic, and as I said, good looking, and this particular one wanted to marry me. I think they were off to the war, and he had a lovely voice and used to sing to me, "Embrace me, my sweet embraceable you." And it was absolutely wonderful.
There were dances in the King's Hall in Aberystwyth, and so we thought we'd like to go. So we walked in to the King's Hall, and we thought, and we were prepared to walk home. But I said, oh, you never know. We might get a Jeep ride in American, because there were Jeeps, American Jeeps around. We were walking somewhere not terribly far from Goggin, and we walked, and this Jeep pulled up, and they said, it was a group of officers, they said, "Hello, girls, would you like a lift? Where are you going?" "Oh, yes, we'd love it. We live right up on the hills." And so we jumped in. Their attitude was so nice. They were, again, gentlemen. So we went up to this little house. We made them a cup of tea, and they couldn't believe it, you know. And they behaved so nicely. It wasn't a while. They weren't out to get us into bed. They were charming. And it's strange that I said, well, maybe a Jeep would come along. It did.
Well, I remember my friend Cooper, I forget what his first name was, but he used to play the alto saxophone. He was a great player, and he played with one of the big bands in America. And he was always a very nice chap, and used to tell us about his experiences with some of these bands who we thought were the masters.
We'd been so used to the lighter orchestras, the local dance bands then, and then we went to one or two dances where there were actually Americans playing, and what a difference it made. The swing, the rhythm was tremendous.
I was home from Sunday school, living in Marble Hall Road, and this six-wheeler truck would turn up, I remember it well, and two black American soldiers came out, knocked the door and said, "Does Win Lodwick live here?" My mother opened the door, and yes, and they got to pick me up and picked up the rest of the band, and we went down to Carmarthen. We were playing actually in what is now Glangwili Hospital.
I met an officer, I think he was a captain or a major, something like that, in the dance in the YMCA. I can remember the man because he had, I can see him now, he's a big man with a red Indian head with a long black feathered headdress as part of his... Anyway, he invited me, and I knew that other girls had been invited, or I wouldn't have accepted, to this dance in Margam Castle. And I got inside and I was very impressed with the wonderful staircase. It was like a Hollywood scene. I waited for my host, this young man who had invited me, and eventually he appeared at the top of the stairs, and to my horror, he was as drunk as a skunk. He was swaying from side to side and shouting down the stairs.
Where's my big, beautiful blonde?
Oh my God, I cannot handle this. And I turned on my heel on my own. I went back to the lorries that were constantly going back and forth to the Odeon Cinema to pick up different girls. And I said, excuse me, would you mind if I came back with you? I can't stay, sorry. And I chickened out, I'm afraid, and I made my way home.
Now, some of our boys were transferred to the 2nd Division. And when they first went to town with this patch of the 2nd Division on their left shoulder, the people didn't like them. So they learned to take off the 2nd Division emblem, put on the 28th Division emblem, which was a red keystone, and then base the 2nd Division emblem on that way. So while they were on duty or in camp, they were 2nd Division men. But when they went to town, they took off the 2nd Division, and they were 28th men, and they were very well treated.
The white Americans were the other side of Bilthwells, other side of the river, to the blacks, and the black men were not allowed to go over the bridge to the other side, which was a little town, and they weren't allowed to go over there, you see. And of course some of them, like everybody else, they were naughty and they found other ways of getting over there. And then this is when the trouble started and the fights.
Because in those days, the blacks lived in one world and the whites lived in another world, and those two worlds did not meet.
There was a lot of fighting over girlfriends and things, eventually leading up to some stabbings even at the end. We didn't know in this country that there was this problem in America. Nobody did, I don't think.
There was one young black man that used to come to tea every Sunday. And the way we met him was that he'd come out for a walk and he'd lost where he was, and he wanted directions back to the camp. And I asked him, would he like a cup of tea? And he came every Sunday after that.
For us Americans, when we have tea, we have a cup of tea. That is our tea. Maybe we'll have a biscuit with it. It's not a meal. So when I was invited to tea, I never expected to be given some sandwiches and everything else. We only had one Christmas party, which was held in the castle, and we had children coming up, and we had gifts for them, and when they gave them a bag of candy, that was their best Christmas that they ever had before.
My friend's little girl, she was 2-year-old at the time, and this American, he'd offered her, as they called it, candies, packet of candies. And the little girl took them, opened the package, and started to write on the wall because she didn't know. Bonbons, they were bonbons, and she didn't know and thought that they were coloured chalk.
They were very generous with their gifts. They also used to give chewing gum out, Kids used to say, any gum chum?
The fact that they had chewing gum was very exciting. That was something new to us.
Got me gum chum.
Yeah, that's right.
And they used to give it to me, and I used to stick it at the back of the headboard, and there was rows of it until my mother found out about it. It used to be stuck under the chairs as well.
If you had a family in town that you would there, you could draw some rations, get some butter, some bacon, or some other things that day, some eggs. Not too much, but you were allowed to bring some of that down there.
My brother was an errand boy, and he delivered goods over to the cookhouse. And one of the guys had asked my brother Bill if he had any sisters, and Billy said yes. You'll never guess, he comes home with a 7-pound tin of fruit cocktail, and I met the young man 2 nights after.
My sister and I were walking along the South Beach one afternoon, 4:30. The tide was out and there were a lot of caves on the South Beach. And I went into one of the caves looking around, and I saw a jerry can, the sort of cans that used to be on the back of Jeeps. Picked it up and I heard liquid sloshing about. So I took the top off and smelt it. It certainly didn't smell like petrol. It smelt like beer. And so then we found another one and another one and another one. We found about 6 jerry cans full of beer. My father, being a very sort of disciplined man, phoned the police and said that we had found some beer on the beach. And the police said, oh, it must be something to do with the Americans. We'll get the American military police to come down. So down came about 6 American military police, and they said, are you sure it's beer? And we said, it smells like it. They said, well, we better taste some then. So they poured some beer into the tankards that my father produced, and they said, yeah, that sure is beer, but we better have another taste to make sure that it's beer. And by the time the military police had left, we had got through, I think, about 2 of the jerry cans, and then they said, well, we better get the Coast Guards in. So they got the Coast Guards in, and the Coast Guard said, are you sure it's beer? And this went on till in the end we had the British police, the American military police, the Coast Guards, and liaison officers. We had the kitchen full of people who were all getting a bit merry, and by the time the evening ended at about 9 o'clock, I think all the beer had gone.
My father was in the military police. He was stationed in Tenby, but he used to come up on furlough to Port Talbot, and he was stationed in the Grand Hotel there. And I remember him telling me that the first night he stayed there was almost his last. He forgot now that there was a gas mantle light on the wall, and of course he didn't realise that you had to turn the gas off, and he decided to blow it out, and nearly gassed himself to death in the process.
Well, the great thing that my daughter will always remember is this wonderful big car coming down the road and stopping, and this officer would take her down to school every morning. And we never ever forgot the generosity and the kindness that he showed to my daughter.
Dear Mom and Dad, sorry it's been so long since the last time I've written you, but I barely have enough time to sleep, let alone write. The hills we have to train on here are incredibly big. They're usually slippery too because it seems to rain here all the time. It's a terrible climate to train in.
The Wiseman's Bridge tragedy was pretty widely known at the time, although it was hushed up tremendously by, I think, the military censorship and the various governments who did not want anything like this to reach the ear of the public. But in an invasion exercise on Wiseman's Bridge beach, I think a couple of landing craft overturned, and as a result of that there were quite a few fatalities.
Oh, I have such fond memories of Ray. He was a factory worker from Detroit, you know, and we got on like a house afire. But I have one very dear memory, and that was I received this message to say to be on the corner at Southcliffe Street at 3:15. And what I didn't know was they were pulling out. It was the convoy. It was quite an impressive sight, really. And the last memory I have was a salute, and I saluted back. And that was it. But I did hear then, later on, that he was wounded. I think it was at Caen, actually. But I've often thought about him. I've often thought about him with great affection, actually.
When they left, I felt very sorry, because not only we'd made friends with this young man, but also my daughter lost her ride to school every day, and she missed it terribly, you know, and it was sad to see them go.
Heartbroken. We got so used to all their flamboyance, their politeness too, and their dancing, the way they danced, the music they brought, their generosity. On the whole, they were a wonderful asset, and we loved all that they brought to Port Albert.
All of a sudden they'd gone and the streets were empty and there were no jeeps running about and nobody to run after and say, have you got any gum or badges? They suddenly went and the town seemed empty. It was brought home to me a few weeks after D-Day when I had an occasion to visit an American hospital, and walking around the wards looking for one particular American that I was trying to find, the scale of the injuries, and it suddenly made a 14-year-old realise what war was all about.
I wrote to a few. Unhappily, I heard that one at least was killed. No, two. A private and a sergeant. I always felt this sergeant knew he was going to die because he was mad.
Dear Mrs. Williams, just a few lines to let you know that I am feeling fine and hope you're the same. God has been very good to me in combat and also in prison. Like you always said, things could always be worse. How is everything with you and the family, Arthur, Bill, and Danny? Here's a surprise. I met my brother over here. I was the happiest guy in the whole world. He looks fine. One thing I want you to know. Your kindness towards me and the other soldiers will never be forgotten. Please forgive me for writing a short letter. I have many friends to write to before I settle down, so take good care of yourself and God bless you. My regards to Bill, Arthur, Ronnie, and Kidwelly. All of my love, Trigger.
This is the Bronze Star I was awarded for picking up the mines and not getting shot by the German machine gun. This is the Purple Heart that I was awarded when I was wounded on November 4th in the Hertigan Forest. And this is the pen I had in my pocket when I was hit in the chest with one bullet, and the second bullet hit the pen.